Open Market is sponsored by AdLib, the self-serve DSP solution making advertising easy. What do the world's largest demand-side platforms have in common? They're effective, but they require large annual contracts and spend minimums. With AdLib, growing agencies get a single platform that connects to every top global DSP with no contracts, no spend minimums, and G2's #1 ranked support. That means access to the entire universe of TV, digital out-of-home, audio, display, video, and native without a hassle and with no blind spots. It's incredibly easy to use, plus it can automate most of the work your team spends hours a day doing manually. Get the most powerful media buying technology without the barriers to entry. Check out AdLib at getadlib.com today.
Michael Bishop, describe your microphone.
It wildly overkill for a small scrappy startup getting into the podcast influencer game here, but apparently I am sounding resonant. So
he's showering mellifluous tones upon us. He also has these nice paintings. His co-founder Steve Liss has apparently upgraded from the cubby in Michael's former apartment into a nice New York apartment with artwork. So we're very happy for Steve.
We are very, especially from the humble beginnings. Go back to episode whatever to hear about that. Joe Zappa, why are we here today and who are we here with?
So we're here with Richard Raddon, the CEO of Zefr, and Michael Bishop, the CTO and co-founder of OpenAds. Richard's team reached out to us about doing a podcast on brand safety, especially responding to the recent content moderation policy shifts from social platforms like X and Meta. And I thought it would be a good opportunity to go a bit broader and talk about brand safety generally. And that's why we have Michael on as well, because Michael used to be an engineer at Moat and often writes about brand safety from a thought leadership perspective. So give us the third-party POV on how does it differ assessing brand safety from on the open web versus in the walled gardens based on your experience, and where does the challenge lie?
I would say let's break this down into tech and into lore. And let's actually start with lore. Flashback to the third-party vendors starting to get into walled garden measurement. And this is something that is public information, but very poorly advertised, is the third-party vendors are not running their own code on the walled gardens. It's essentially the walled gardens are running all of the measurement. Those signals are being sent to the vendors, and the vendors are essentially, they have their QA teams manually checking at intervals, hey, does this check out?
That's true with viewability. That's true with IBT. With brand safety and suitability, we're sent signals about what the content is, what the language is around it. So it's a little, that nuance is important, but you're absolutely correct.
That's what I'm saying. It's entirely a server-to-server integration. And this actually gets into, if you look at the recent kerfuffle around GARM lawsuit with Twitter X and advertisers fleeing it. I actually dug into this a little bit into their terms of service and definitions and some manual testing on, how does brand safety actually work on this platform? Because what people are observing is, hey, there's a lot of nudity and Nazis here, and there are ads serving. And yet DB is saying, oh, this is 99.9% brand safe. And that actually can be squared if you define brand safety as only looking at adjacent posts above and below an ad, which I don't think that was commonly understood by advertisers whatsoever. And they just came in and looked at the platform and took the naive understanding of, I'm seeing Nazis and nudity. How is this brand safe? And so that sort of gets into this, putting on the post-structuralist nerd hat for a little bit. What is brand safety? How are we defining it? How are we measuring it? What is the actual objective here? Because sort of going back to the initial iteration of it, I think it was sort of built on this core mythos of, say you are an advertiser at United Airlines. You do not want ads running next to articles about airplane crashes. It's this entirely fear-based motion where sort of the goal is to avoid bad screenshots on social media. And if anything bad does happen with the targeting and ad delivery, well, you have this scapegoat as a service company you can blame for that, as opposed to it being the actual media buyer or targeting system at play.
Well, Michael, let me interject there really quickly. So the reason GARM was important is GARM created a framework to say, look, we're going to actually define what brand safety means, and all the platforms are going to abide by this, and they were a part of it. So if you ask the true definition of brand safety, not brand suitability, so there's 4 tiers in Global Alliance for Responsible Media in the framework. The floor, which doesn't really make a lot of sense, but that's the stuff that is considered non-brand safe. And it's the stuff that everyone agrees shouldn't be on the platform. And that is defined in each of the 12 categories. For instance, in arms and ammunition, if somebody pulls out a gun and shoots somebody and kills them, right, that is non-brand safe. So you can have, you're absolutely right about adjacency. You can go on certain platforms and see, let's just pick on X because we don't work with X and it's easy for me to talk about it. But you can see stuff that's probably not suitable, and their community guidelines allow for that, right? And Elon's a big proponent of free speech and whatnot. But when it comes to floor violations, that content, everybody has agreed that content shouldn't be uploaded. So you shouldn't see ISIS beheading videos and things of that nature. That's why you can get a 99.9% brand safety rating, right? But yet there's lots of stuff that you and I would be like, would I want my neighbor to see this content? It's probably not suitable. Or if you're an advertiser, would I want to be associated with this content? And that's where and there's low risk, high risk, medium risk, and all that. So I think all that detail is super important for the audience.
And this actually gets into the tech side of things rather than the lore. Like in the mid 2010s, a lot of the early brand safety systems, they might have advertised as, we have very fancy natural language processing and machine learning systems. The reality is it was thousands of regular expressions for keyword lists. And that's why the tech, frankly, didn't work very well in a lot of cases. And that's why you saw news getting systematically demonetized. Because if you have an article that's saying Kobe Bryant is the bomb getting flagged for firearms, well, yeah, it's a naive tech system. And obviously it should not have worked that way, but that's just kind of what was implemented. And it took a lot of time and industry criticism for that to actually come into the public zeitgeist of understanding that.
By the way, we saw that play out publicly in 2020 when COVID hit, right? And that was actually a public thing that happened. Basically, what happened is all the publishers got together on the open web and said, oh my gosh, all this content that we have is no longer being monetized because of brand safety concerns. Why? Because almost every article had something about, hey, the NBA draft is coming up, but by the way, it's going to be delayed because of the virus and because of COVID. And it was looking at the NLP that they were using at that time, was flagging that as inappropriate content, where normally those two things wouldn't go together. And that's where we in the walled gardens just knew, okay, this is a much more nuanced problem. It's going to take a completely different architecture to solve it. It's going to be in this AI realm that we're going to be using. At that time, we were using smaller models. Today, we use a hybrid between the large language models and smaller trained models. And that is not easy to do, despite, by the way, and I love Brian O'Kelly. I think he's smart. He's had 2 exits. By the way, I'm professionally happy that he's getting the conversation going around using AI. Personally, I'm bummed that he's not going to help save the world with climate change stuff. But, that's where it's a little bit, he's taking off-the-shelf models and saying, look, the F1 scores on these are great. And F1 is basically it's the harmonic mean between precision and recall. That's a fancy way of saying it analyzes your false positives and false negatives. And it's a very good gauge to understand how good you are at understanding content, or understanding labeling content, I should say.
Yeah, I think the argument Brian would make is obviously that when you solve for media quality, it turns out you actually do solve for sustainability and viewability and all sorts of things. But I think there are kind of 2 different tiers of discussion here. And Michael raised the first tier that is often missed, which is is this entire thing sort of misguided, right? Is the pursuit of brand safety defined as I don't want to show up against a plane crash because that's going to tarnish my brand? Is that even valid? An entire ecosystem has been built on the desire to avoid those kinds of associations, when I think it's often unclear that those associations are actually deleterious to a brand. So that's kind of the first thing. And Michael, I thought you could talk a little bit more about that. The second thing is then how well we're actually executing against that brand safety goal. And that is where we get into conversations about how is it different to assess brand safety on the open web versus in walled gardens, or something like how is AI going to upgrade our ability to assess brand safety and keep brands safe according to their own parameters. Michael, could you address the first thing? Having worked at Moat and seeing this, do you think there's a legitimate case for brand safety to sort of preserve the value of brand reputations, or do you think it's more dubious than most people understand?
To put this potentially indelicately, I have seen basically 0 research asserting any meaningful return on ad spend or tangible value from sort of the naive legacy brand safety, do not put my airplane ads next to airplane crashes type of brand safety. Adjacent to this is how the concept and the term evolved to sort of eat into brand suitability. And I think part of that might have been due to just the incentives at play for the vendors wanting to sell more solutions and wanting to drive outcomes. But my understanding is, no, I have seen no systemic research asserting that there is any actual measurable value. The best that you'll see is that I'm aware of anyway, are opinionated surveys of customers where you ask them questions like, if you saw this next to a terrorist video, would you think less of them? And people obviously say yes, which I would say that has not actually been borne out in measured practice. I think largely because people are usually not going out to search for videos of terrorist beheadings. And the people who do, I think, are a relative minority and not the ones being surveyed in these studies.
When was that study done?
So back in the Moat days, our head of brand safety on the product side was a guy named Jay Pino, and he runs a Substack where he got into citing a bunch of the studies. But what I've seen so far is that like naive brand safety is sort of around the like core archetypal avoidance of really bad stuff is sold more on fear and vibes than demonstrable value.
Totally agree. So Joe, to your point, Meta had like 7 years of research that they'd release every year before they got into doing any brand safety controls. That adjacency had no impact whatsoever on how consumers felt about the brand. So there's tons of studies out there that'll say the other thing. I guess it just comes down to, at the end of the day, if you are a marketer and you're spending hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars over the course of the history of your company, if it's P&G, do you really want to just what does your intuition say? Would you like to be around sort of positive, good content, or do you want to be around content that potentially, you don't agree with or doesn't agree with your brand constitution? And so at the end of the day, I do think a lot can be made out of this. And I think it's less about that. That's why, like at Zefr, it wasn't about like, hey, we're a brand safety company. It's like, let's be the company that understands content at scale better than any other company in the world, third-party company in the world. And let's do it across multiple platforms that all, make up the public square. The only platform we decided not to work on, and we're not working on, is X. And that has a lot to do with just the nature of that platform. We do have a moderation team. We do have a policy team. Your employees are exposed to a lot of stuff on that platform. I mean, look, pornography, it's allowed on that platform. It's rampant on that platform. So we choose to work on different platforms. By the way, I think, and I'm a fan of X in terms of as a user, I like to use the platform. I talk to marketers all the time, and in terms of its effectiveness, even before Elon bought it, it was questionable about how effective it was in terms of reaching consumers and getting them buy their products and services. So, but we work on Snap. We like that platform a lot. We like the direction they're going. Mostly because the difference is I would say, Michael, and you can speak to this, because Moat was mostly open web. In fact, I think you used the back end of Grapeshot, right, to get a lot of signal about what the web page is. It's part of the reason you guys bought Grapeshot. But the walled gardens, a lot of the fear and loathing and stuff that went on to sell people in the old days on the open web doesn't really work. Like you can't partner with Meta and go, by the way, you should be very afraid of all the content on Meta. Because believe me, the next call that happens from that advertiser, that agency, is to the Meta rep that says, we were in here and we just saw a terrible story about all the horrific content. It's much more symbiotic, the relationship between the platform. And some people have argued, well, does it make you truly independent and third party? I'd like to say that it has. We pushed back against the platforms. Our policy teams get in heated debates about, how you define certain aspects of the 12 categories and the subcategories now that everybody does. But it's just a different environment to work in the walled gardens than the open web.
There's two things I kind of want to touch on following that. One being that 100% agree that context is, I think, both the more valuable and more durable way to approach things. Again, what I've seen in terms of studies and carried out research is that contextual suitability really does drive outcomes. Like sort of the point of putting ads next to symbiotic or relevant content does lead to higher propensity to engage with those ads. So that's sort of like, I think my hot take on this topic is we kind of need to drag the industry kicking and screaming out of talking about brand safety and more to sort of the underlying principle of what are good places to put a given ad and what is the best ad to put in a given place. Whether we call that brand suitability or contextual targeting or like curation and quality, like the point is put good ads on good content. I would say that's like one piece of it. And the other is like more on the incentives angle and comparing like Twitter X to the other walled gardens and why there was such a brand safety kerfuffle on Twitter. I think might in part come down to my understanding of the history here, and this is a little loose, is that they kind of failed to actually drive performance from their ad product. Whereas Facebook, Instagram, Meta as a whole, their ads perform really well. I think part of this is that And this sort of touches on the like future facing question on like content moderation is if you can drive performance, do advertisers really care that much?
What's interesting about what you bring up is that a lot of these platforms are moving to sort of AI driven performance engines, right? So you got PMax on Google, you got Advantage Plus on Meta, and I'm sure TikTok will have something soon, maybe. And they're using a whole host of signals, right? They've got the audience data as well as other pieces of data to be able to drive performance. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, understanding the content is one signal, but you never want to choke the algorithm. And I'm really sensitive to that because brands do want performance, right? So how can you work in a world where you understand the nuances of suitability? And by the way, it's really vast. It is so vast. The one brand that might be a CPG product, they don't want to be around like any conversation or anything around plastics, right? There's nothing non-brand safe about plastics, but they just don't want to be around it. And I get that. So how do you block that content and allow these AI-driven algorithms from the platforms to actually do their thing? And that's really hitting the sweet spot. But I also think, by the way, we love to just give trends, overall trends from the public market or the public square, I should say. I always feel like the redheaded stepchild when I go to ad tech conferences because everybody's talking about the open web. There's 1,000 companies talking about the open web. And the thing that really just gets us excited is the amount of conversation, the velocity of content that's happening on these digital public squares. It just dwarfs the open web by a magnitude of thousands. It's not even close. I mean, 600 hours are uploaded every 60 seconds to YouTube. The velocity is far greater than that. Even TikTok, the amount of content is amazing. So the conversations that are happening there, the content that is happening there, I think can be really empowering to marketers. And that's what we try to do is unlock that value.
Joe earlier asked about the difference between open web and walled gardens. And I would say there's actually a third category from a technical perspective, which is mobile apps, just because they don't really work the same way as the open web where you can scrape text content. Like you kind of have to have a direct like SDK integration with the app to really do any kind of content classification there. And so I think that's maybe part of some of the underinformed like advertiser legacy failures being just not like quite properly understanding what are the limitations of a given platform, how are things being measured, like in detail, what is the methodology on that? And I think that sort of touches on, but not just the walled gardens, but like any mobile app ecosystem, like you end up with integration issues. And if the brand safety solution is just at an app level, well, that's kind of useless.
I totally agree. But by the way, Michael, this is the thing that kind of frustrates me a little bit about as I dug into this industry and got into it in 2017. I'm like, there's not a whole lot of appetite to understand the nuances behind this stuff. And that's what like, before this call, I was reading the MRC rebuttal, and we're big fans of MRC, and we think the auditing is super robust what they do, but it's so mismarketed in the industry. So what happens is brands go in and they get MRC accreditation. What MRC accreditation does is it sets up a very robust audit process. And within the context of that audit process, it gives you certification. What happens in the market is people take that MRC accreditation and say, look, we were MRC accredited for this, so we have the superior solution. They use it as a qualitative endorsement and not of what it truly is. It's saying, yeah, you have these systems, you process this data, this is all accurate, you do it in a responsible way, But for the most part, MRC accreditation shouldn't be so aligned with like a superior product offering. All that's lost on the industry. Like everyone's like, speaking shorthand and the headlines. And I think that's why they get into problems, right? MRC's response today from the analytics report was like, hey, we didn't MRC accredited for pre-bid IBT. And I know less about that world, but basically they were saying, analytics, you threw us under the bus, but we never actually said this is what we accredited for. This is what we accredited for in IBT. So back off.
Having been through the audit process, it is definitely such that brands and buyers are outsourcing their evaluation of a vendor to, is it MRC accredited? When that is not a qualitative signal. What it is a signal of resources and credibility, where it's okay, you can trust that this vendor measures the way they say they measure. But that is different from like reliability or accuracy of the tech. That's something that broadly as an industry, we kind of need to demand more of like transparency around. It's insane to me that you can't ask a brand safety vendor, hey, here's the URL on the open web. How did you classify this? And like there's a lore point here of Integral AdSense had a tool doing that for I think less than a week before they pulled it. A lot of the results were not good.
Well, that was during the 2020 kerfuffle. They put it up publicly. And by the way, we were on there. We're like, okay, let's see how it measures this content. And when they realized everybody was doing that, and by the way, I completely agree with what you say. And that's one of the things that we drove. And by the way, this is what Brian O'Kelly, and there's another vendor out there that I think is really good on the open web as well, Protected Media, which is owned by MediaOcean. It's really good tech. I've looked into it. I haven't gone deep on it, but I really like what I've seen and the demos, and I've liked, and they want to be very transparent. But at the end of the day, when I sit with brands and they say, well, you're 100% accurate all the time, I'm like, hell no. Who told you that? And they're like, oh no, we just had another vendor in here that said they're never making a mistake. They never, and I'm like, what is this? Like, I guess this is why people get very jaded in this industry. I'm like, I would never say that. And by the way, that's why we're totally transparent in our dashboard with all our labeling, because you can see if we mislabel content, there's actually a way to say, hey, you got this wrong and whatnot. We want those inputs. That's how you refine your models. You get better.
An interesting point about the reframe from brand safety to brand suitability and contextual targeting, which I really like. And I totally agree, Richard, Rich. The only person who calls me Joseph is my mom, so I totally get you on that. The interesting thing about the reframe from brand safety to suitability and contextual targeting, too, is that you can see contextual targeting and brand suitability as a common sense thing that would drive better performance through relevance. And you also see DV and IAS in the last year or so trying to move toward performance in their messaging. So that would suggest that they've also sort of caught on to this, that on the one hand, they have to keep talking about the brand safety thing, because that's kind of the why big brands have to pay them piece of it is we're afraid to get screenshotted. And that's a very powerful retention driver, I would imagine, is that they don't want a scandal because they canceled their DVRIS subscription. But then if you can move away from the negative case into the positive case and say, hey, we're going to drive better ROAS, or we're going to help you drive more sales because we're putting you next to more relevant content, you're reaching more relevant audiences, then that's a positive case that hinges less on the potentially dubious assertion or assumption that, showing up next to that plane crash article is going to kill your brand.
One very on-point example here is I think all of us are probably familiar with the double verify blocking clouds. Well, I think blaming post-bid blocking on the vendors is, I think, not even quite the right frame, because that's something that demand for that came from the buy side, where, frankly, post-bid brand safety blocking makes zero sense whatsoever. That's something that always should have just been solved at the targeting and bidding layer. But brands asked for it, and so there was a monetary incentive to build this, so people went out and built it. Educating brands is such a big part of the importance of measurement and the importance of optimization and what we talk about as an industry and how we work, and asking more of our vendors and asking more in terms of transparency and willingness to show your work and how it drives outcomes, I think is that's sort of the optimistic case of how to frame this.
Michael, how are you thinking about brand safety in the coming era of AI? Both from, and I'll steal your exact words from the previous pod, which I've stolen so many times, and I tend to give you credit when I can, right? The technology side with how we do this, but then maybe even more interesting, what does brand safety even look like on the platform side as consumers are interacting with LLMs, as agents are doing work? How should we even wrap our heads around what brand safety and suitability might look like in that world?
I think that this is part of why I frame it around suitability for driving performance. And this sort of dovetails into how the concept of attention has evolved too, where it's sort of the early base case, advocating for, hey, your ads literally are not even having the opportunity to be seen. That was a starting point. That was a building block. And I think you can sort of keep bolting on additional measures, additional proxies of what it means for someone to pay attention to an ad, to give consideration to it, whether that's measured signals like mouse movement, dwell time, whether that's placement quality and competing for screen real estate share, whether that's panel surveys of creative quality, all of these sort of bolt under what I would call an underlying concept of the way I internally think about it is minimizing friction of do you make it easier for someone to consider a given brand? Part of how I see this evolving is we're going to need to be a little flexible and a little open-minded with what do terms mean? What does brand safety mean? What does suitability mean? What does attention mean? And this is part of why transparency is incredibly important, why continued dialogue with the industry is incredibly important, is because as we are charting into new territory, and I love my 3-letter acronyms as much as anyone in ad tech, there's going to be people coining new terms. I've jokingly, only partially jokingly said, well, okay, we need to start thinking about non-human but valid traffic. Because if you're talking about like AI agents going out and transacting on behalf of a buyer, that is something that can technically have an opportunity for advertising. Like, and this sort of like reframes what does it mean to have attention, to have consideration, where if the consumer is no longer a human, that is a conversation we're going to have in the coming years. No one's even started talking about this.
I mean, we've seen an explosion of brand misappropriation, which that wouldn't even have existed before these foundational models came out, right? So we're just going to see an explosion of that. And by the way, Joe, in your preview, you mentioned the fact that, I mean, it's pretty common knowledge that most of the platforms have decided to open up the aperture in terms of freedoms of speech. My thinking has evolved on that. I was always pretty like, I'm a pretty conservative guy. I'm like, no, I don't. It's the public square. We got to be very careful with this. Unfortunately, I now live in Orange County because I did live in the Pacific Palisades, and I moved down to Orange County, which is a very conservative place. I see a lot of red hats around, and when I tell them what I do, we work on these platforms. They're all like, "Are you restricting free speech?" I mean, they're very sensitized. I'd say most of the country to the fact that, hey, these are public squares. We need to be able to express different opinions, and so I do think that that's sort of the right direction for the platforms to move, but it does complicate, especially given the fact that these foundational models are so accessible by everybody. I mean, a 13-year-old, my kid does all his homework using ChatGPT now, and it's just shocking how, and the newest models are incredible, Claude and Gemini and Llama. So
I think my take on this is almost like a call to action for the industry on like less about moderation in and of itself and more around the question of what is it optimal for a platform to be doing? Like, depending on how you are billing an ad, how you are optimizing, how you are measuring that, like, what is it optimal for the platform to do? If it's a naive, like you're billing based on like 100% of the ad visible for any amount of time, and then you're not like actually digging into any engagement, digging into any optimization around the surrounding content, around the suitability of that, then what you get is a platform that, well, it's optimized for engagement and rage bait and content that is both less suitable for advertising and like actually leads to less engagement with those ads, because all of a sudden you have people primed to fight and tribalize and politicize. And I would say that that's like a second order effect coming from bad ad incentives, frankly.
I think we might be able to identify a convergence of these trends into a sort of synthetic argument that would like solve some of our problems, which of course we're going to do right here on this podcast. So one is, I really like the idea of the shift from safety to suitability. I think the case for safety has always been a little dubious, and just reframing it around performance, like aligns this space with the focus on outcomes that has generally been the focus of advertising over the past few years, and creates like a more positive evidence-based business case for the solutions in this category. So I like that. Two is there's an obvious application of AI to that shift. Right. So, I mean, this is why Brian has taken Scope 3 in this direction, but obviously he's not the only one working on this. Like, if you can use LLMs to understand content on a much more granular level, you can then do much better contextual targeting or brand suitability alignment, however you want to put it. And that should drive better performance, but also increase relevance and avoid what people are afraid of in the brand safety category, which is your content showing up next to content to which it's not relevant or that you really wouldn't want to show up next to. There is also an implication of this argument and this mindset shift for the content moderation piece, because if we move away from the fear-based case for brand safety, maybe we can all kind of have what we want in that. Then like the people who are more free speech oriented and who say we should have very broad latitude for what people can say on these platforms, we can say, okay, yeah, do your thing. And you know what? For the most part, we're not going to worry about it that much from an advertising perspective because we are going to solve it via contextual targeting and brand suitability. So it's like if there's speech we don't like on these platforms, it can be there, and that's the business of people who are interacting with that, but our brand just won't show up next to it because our brand isn't going to perform as well if it's showing up next to it because it doesn't align with our parameters or the content we're interested in.
100%. And I think you can actually like even look at some of the big decisions by some of the platforms around, like look at Reddit, like the entire like image and GIF hosting kerfuffle drama, whatever you want to call it, is built around sort of clunky ad buying systems. Where advertisers really don't want to be next to not safe for work content. And so that actually necessitated a technology shift in how they built their platform. And I think that it's sort of the inverse of that, where better technology means you don't have to do something as clunky. You can sort of buy into what might have traditionally been riskier platforms enabled by technology and enabled by driving outcomes and value rather than, well, being afraid of bad social media screenshots.
I think that's a good note to end on. Michael and Rich, thank you so much for joining us. I'm glad we could solve all of the problems pertaining to brand safety on this 35-minute podcast. And have a great weekend, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week.